It is some sort of indigenous washing almost of the COP. We are on indigenous land here, and even those indigenous leaders who are from these lands are not being included. My name is Helena Gualinga. I come from the Quechua people of Sarayaku in the Ecuadorian Amazon. I grew up in Sarayaku, and I've spent kind of my life partially in the Ecuadorian Amazon in Sarayaku, but also in Finland, where my dad is from. And I've, since a very early age, engaged in advocacy. The political climate has changed incredibly in the past few years. The world has changed. I think we live in a completely different world. And there was some sort of momentum that was built by young people, and it kind of comes and goes. So the momentum, there is momentum, and then there isn't. And it's kind of this like wave of momentum of talking about climate that I think young people have contributed to. That's been really important.
Is it momentum within the youth movement, or is it momentum that the youth movement has over the larger process?
Yeah, I think like
or both.
Probably both, but I think I'm speaking to the way that people talked about climate change or climate action, or the emphasis on climate action that was, everyone was talking about it in 2019, for example. And then the world kind of just went into crazy mode, and then it was, top 5 on the priority list or top 10 on the priority list of the media, of, just like political agenda, so forth.
And where are we now with it?
Where are we now? I think we're kind of, we're in the Amazon. And yeah, which is so strange to be in the Amazon with all of these people that you kind of meet everywhere else. And this is supposed to be the COP of the Amazon, the COP of the forest. And there's been, so much expectation put on this COP, and we'll see how it actually turns out.
What are young people expecting from the COP? Is there a general statement that you could make? I know that that's a very difficult question to answer.
I think rather than speaking to the youth voice, I think I've been much more familiar with kind of the Indigenous process and the Indigenous movement, both in Ecuador, but also kind of the global Indigenous movement that engages with climate spaces. And I think one of the most important things at this COP was enhanced participation, which what I'm hearing from people inside is that they're not just being denied, the floor, but also just entry to the negotiating spaces. So the Indigenous Peoples Constituency, which is the Indigenous Peoples negotiating body at the UN, is being denied entry, and they are let in upon insistence, or pulling the strings, but that shouldn't be the case. They should be respected as the autonomous governments that we are. And so the kind of narrative around this being the Indigenous COP is, I guess it's sort of concerning, because it is some sort of indigenous washing almost of the COP. And I think even just before getting here, I personally was really excited about seeing if Indigenous peoples for the first time were going to have the floor, and especially as it is in our home in the Amazon rainforest. What I've said for so many years is our territories, our lands, our rights are being negotiated elsewhere, and now it's come here to our home, basically. Are we going to be able to have a say? And what I'm hearing is that we are not, and it's really concerning and disappointing.
Is that what the protests were about?
I think the protests, they weren't. What I'm hearing from them, I was just in a brief conversation with some people that participated yesterday, and it wasn't organized necessarily by the general Indigenous movement, rather by leaders who are being excluded from the official spaces. The access to, badges to the Blue Zone is so incredibly restricted. We are on Indigenous land here, and even those Indigenous leaders who are from these lands are not being included and let in. And separately from the COP, oil drilling was just given announced and given a green light here in Pará, which is something else that Indigenous peoples from Pará are, upset about and denouncing, and beyond too.
You talked about Indigenous washing, because there's been so much narrative up till this point that this would be the COP of the Indigenous. Do you feel like there has been an outreach to Indigenous communities to help co-create what's happened here? Because that's certainly the narrative that's being told.
I mean, I am sure that there has been some efforts, I think, with, like just the fact that there is a ministry of Indigenous peoples in Brazil. So much work is being done through that. And I think, although that exists, I don't know if that's been enough. And Brazil is huge, and Latin America is huge, and like there's so many people. And I mean, like it's really a challenge to make sure that everyone is included. However, the fact that people within the negotiating spaces, those that have the blue badge, like the badges to the blue zones, and that they are not, being given the floor or able to participate, I think that is like what represents also how people are being treated outside.
One of the really big things the government of Brazil has tried to focus the world's attention on here is around forest protection of standing forest, the Tropical Forest Forever facility, and that's been one of the sources of momentum, but it's also something we've heard pretty mixed reports about in terms of the Indigenous consultations and engagements, because this is all about protecting Indigenous land. Is there anything that you would say about that from the conversations you've had around how you feel that's been structured and whether it's been appropriate?
Indigenous people in Brazil have been calling for the demarcation of their lands for, before this government, during this government. We heard Cacique Raoni, one of the biggest, most respected chiefs from the Brazilian Amazon, from the Kayapo people, denouncing President Lula, which I think speaks a lot to kind of the expectations that were set and what's actually being met. And, they're oil drilling happening, mining expansion happening. Again, this is very limited to Brazil, and I wouldn't, I can speak more to those things in Ecuador, but there's definitely a huge disappointment because there was so much that was promised, and very little is being done, and especially when it comes to the land demarcations and securing Indigenous people's rights in this country, which it's like this constant battle of just like maintaining what already is, and there's like bill after bill coming after Indigenous peoples all the time.
So that's a domestic Brazil issue. It's not necessarily a COP30 issue, or is it being demonstrated there?
I mean, the Indigenous people's participation has been a COP issue, a UNFCCC issue, and it's been something that we've advocated for so long. I think there was an expectation that was set that this COP was going to be different, but it is business as usual. So there is the same issue that we've seen for the 30 years of COP, and then there is these domestic issues with Indigenous people's rights in Brazil, in Ecuador, in Colombia, in Peru that we can all speak to, and that are, it's kind of like these issues kind of go hand in hand and excludes Indigenous peoples from participating anywhere. I mean, we're not having a say in what happens to our lands back home or here, those who are from here, and then when it comes to kind of setting these, global international frameworks at COP, and we're trying to do it that way, then we're being, the door is shut in our face.
I think it's rather unfortunate that we have fallen into the simplistic thinking of assuming that when we use the word Indigenous communities or First Nation peoples, that covers the gamut. It's a little bit like walking into the Amazon and using the name of one tree and assuming that represents the entire Amazon. So could you give us a flavor of the diversity that is under that?
Yeah, I love the example with the tree. I think it really speaks to it. Yes, Indigenous peoples are so incredibly diverse and different, and I think there's like a lot of like shared values that brings us together. But again, we all have our own governing bodies and our own kind of governance structures and representation structures that we function through. I mean, just in Ecuador, my peoples, we're very, very, very small people, but we live and practice autonomy and sovereignty, and so does everyone else. And putting us all together in a box, I think, has been, damaging or detrimental to our that sovereignty and independence, and not being able to see that there is so much diversity within Indigenous communities, and especially when it comes to a place like COP. I think it's been very easy to just check the box for an Indigenous individual. Like even myself, I am an Indigenous individual. I'm not representing my people even, unless they have told me, okay, go on the podcast and represent Sarayaku, which, that has happened a few times. When they do so, I'm happy to do it, and it's the biggest honor. But if that doesn't happen, I'm representing my own individual. And I think at these like spaces, it's very easy to just have the, almost as if Indigenous peoples have been tokenized, and it erases completely the diversity, not just within the Amazon, but I mean, within, in Ecuador, there's Indigenous people from the mountains or from the Andes, from the highlands that are so different to Indigenous people from the Amazon. And erasing that diversity limits us and limits our participation.
I think the challenge with that is, how do you honor and respect that diversity and have a representation that allows for all of those peoples to speak with a voice that represents all without having millions of people at the table?
Exactly. I think it would be enough to have, or not enough, that I'll take that back. But I think one step forward would be, but I've spoke to this a little bit earlier, but would be to have the people that already are inside to have a seat at the table. I mean, if those who are today representing us with the limited representation that we have, and they are not able to be at the table, be able to speak, I mean, then that is the issue. And then we can work inwards and see, okay, how do we organize better, and how do we make sure that the participation is, is better represented. But we got to start with the very basic issues that we're seeing.
And one of the things that we heard a lot about coming here was about consultations with Indigenous to ensure that policies, maybe from Brazil, represented Indigenous perspectives, particularly when it comes to forest policies. What does best practice look like in terms of that consultation? Because as you said, the diversity there means you have to respect that and engage broadly. But are there ways to engage that do meet the necessity of the broad conversation, despite how many options there are to engage?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the, what is it called? Like sideline pieces of free, prior, and informed consent is prior. So it needs to happen prior to anything happening. Like, okay,
it's sort of what it means.
Yeah,
prior.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And again, I can only speak to kind of where I come from with more detail. But in Sarayaku, for example, we have our own free, prior, and informed consent law, and it's like, if you guys want to talk to us, read this first. And there it says, like, we're not open to even engaging in a consultation process with an oil company or a mining company. Like, we don't want to be consulted. And there's a clear, like, step by step, this is what free and prior looks like for us. And this is how our decision making looks like. This is how our cultural ways of making decision looks like. And you kind of, this is what it's there, and it's online. You can look it up if you want to. So that's for my people. Again, I'm sure it's very different here, and it's diverse. And then if you truly want to do it right, then you got to put in the effort and go and learn.
Right.
Thank you so much. Thank you for taking time here at the COP. Thank you for taking time away from your studies at Yale.
Thank you so
Thanks
much for
so
having
much.
me.